What if I told you that in less than 48 hours the entire fate of Germany's last great offensive in the West was sealed? Not by months of grinding battle, not by overwhelming numbers, but by speed. By one sudden shift that German commanders never believed possible. In the frozen forest of the Ardennes, buried under snow and silence, something broke on December 26, 1944. And when it broke, it changed the course of the war in Western Europe forever. This is History Plus, and today we are stepping into the moment when time itself turned against Germany. Before we go any further, if you enjoy clear, powerful World War II stories told in a way that makes the strategy easy to understand, take a second to like this video and subscribe to History Plus. It really helps the channel grow, and it lets me keep bringing you stories like this one. Now, let's go back to the snow. In December 1944, Germany launched what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The goal was bold and desperate. German forces would smash through the Allied lines in the Ardennes forest, split the American and British armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into negotiations. It was a gamble built on surprise. The weather was terrible. Heavy clouds grounded Allied aircraft. Snow covered the narrow roads. The Americans did not expect a major attack in that sector. For a brief moment, it worked. German units pushed forward. American lines bent. Confusion spread. But at the center of this offensive stood a small Belgian town, Bastogne. Bastogne was not important because of its size. It was important because of its roads. Several major highways crossed there. Control Bastogne, and you controlled movement in the region. Lose it, and your advance slowed to a crawl. German planners knew this. That is why they moved quickly to surround the town after the offensive began. Inside Bastogne were American troops, including elements of the 101st Airborne Division. They were surrounded. The weather was freezing, supplies were limited, artillery shells fell day and night. German commanders believed time was on their side. If Bastogne fell, the road network would open fully for the German advance. In German headquarters, maps showed red arrows pushing west. Officers believed the Americans would need days, maybe weeks, to reorganize. The snow and ice would delay any serious counterattack. Fuel was already becoming a problem for German armored units, but if the advance kept moving, captured Allied fuel depots might solve that. Everything depended on momentum. But far to the south, something unexpected was happening. The U.S. Third Army, under General George S. Patton, was not standing still. When the German attack began, Patton was already planning for different possibilities. In a remarkable move of preparation, he had anticipated that the Germans might strike. While other commanders debated, Patton had his staff draft contingency plans. When the order came to turn north toward Bastogne, he was ready. Turning an entire army in winter was no small task. Roads were clogged. Vehicles slid on ice. Communication lines were strained. Yet within days, American columns were moving hard, through the snow toward Bastogne. This was not a slow response. It was aggressive, determined, and fast. On December 26, 1944, American armored units broke through to Bastogne from the south. The encirclement was shattered. The trapped defenders were no longer alone. For German commanders, this was more than a tactical setback. It was a shock. In German headquarters, reports arrived that American tanks had reached the town. The assumption of delay had been wrong. The weather had not stopped them. The Americans had acted with speed and coordination, and speed had once been Germany's greatest strength. The relief of Bastogne exposed deeper problems within the German plan. Fuel shortages were becoming critical. Many tanks were running low. Air support was limited, especially once the weather began to clear. German supply lines stretched thin through narrow forest roads that were vulnerable to attack. Every mile forward cost resources that could not easily be replaced. Meanwhile, American logistics were improving. As skies cleared, Allied aircraft returned. Fighter bombers attacked German convoys. Bridges were targeted. Road junctions were bombed. German troops who had once advanced confidently now had to move mostly at night to avoid air attacks. The psychological impact was just as powerful as the military one. German commanders had believed the Americans would react slowly. Instead, they saw a level of flexibility and speed that forced them to rethink everything. The initiative was slipping away. Adolf Hitler in Berlin refused to accept the seriousness of the setback. He demanded counterattacks. He ordered Bastogne to be retaken. But the reality at the front was harsh. Units were exhausted. Ammunition was limited. Fuel was measured in days, sometimes hours. Continuing the offensive without regaining Bastogne made the entire operation unstable. As December turned toward January, the Ardennes Offensive began to lose strength. American forces did not just hold. They pushed back. The bulge in the Allied line that had given the battle its name slowly began to shrink. German formations found themselves overextended, facing counterattacks from multiple directions. The relief of Bastogne became a symbol. It showed that Germany no longer controlled the tempo of the war in the West. The Allies did. Once the Americans stabilized their lines, their industrial power and logistics began to dominate. Germany could not match that level of supply and reinforcement. For the soldiers on the ground, the change was visible. American troops in Bastogne, once cold and isolated, now fought with renewed energy. Reinforcements brought supplies and ammunition. Artillery coordination improved. German assaults met stiff resistance and increasing counterfire. German soldiers, on the other hand, faced growing uncertainty. Orders to hold positions came even when those positions were difficult to defend. Retreat was politically sensitive and often delayed. Every delay meant more losses. The larger truth became clear to many German officers. The Ardennes Offensive had asked too much of a nation already exhausted by years of war. Industry was strained. Fuel supplies were dwindling. The Luftwaffe no longer had the strength to challenge Allied air superiority consistently. Even if local successes were achieved, sustaining them was another matter entirely. Patton's rapid relief of Bastogne did not win the war by itself, but it marked the moment when the German gamble began to unravel beyond repair. It showed that surprise alone was not enough. Speed and initiative had returned to the Allied side. As January progressed, Allied forces pushed the Germans back toward their starting positions. The ground gained in the initial offensive was slowly lost. Casualties mounted. Equipment losses could not be replaced quickly. The dream of splitting the Allied armies faded. Looking back, historians often point to Bastogne as the hinge point of the battle. Not because it was the largest engagement, but because it represented a turning of momentum. Wars are not only about territory, they are about initiative, about who forces the other side to react. On December 26, 1944, that initiative shifted. The maps in German headquarters changed. Arrows that once pointed west were shortened, then reversed. Defensive lines were redrawn. Orders shifted from advance to survival. For the Allies, the successful relief boosted morale. It demonstrated coordination, planning, and resilience under pressure. It reassured commanders that even in winter, rapid maneuver was possible. For Germany, it marked the beginning of the end of offensive capability in the West. After the Ardennes, German forces would largely fight defensively until the war ended in May 1945. When we talk about 48 hours that broke the Ardennes, we are not exaggerating. In those 2 days, assumptions collapsed. A surrounded town was relieved. A desperate offensive lost its balance. And commanders on both sides understood that something fundamental had changed. If you've made it this far, you can see how one decision, one rapid movement can shift an entire campaign. Let me know in the comments what moment you think was the true turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. Was it the initial surprise, the stand at Bastogne, or the Allied air power once the skies cleared? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you found this breakdown helpful and clear, share this video with someone who enjoys World War II history. Your support helps History Plus reach more viewers who want real, straightforward storytelling without confusion. Because sometimes, history does not turn over years. Sometimes it turns in 48 hours. The snow did not stop falling after Bastogne was relieved. It kept coming down, soft and silent, covering burned-out vehicles, shattered trees and frozen bodies. But under that white blanket, the battle was far from over. If anything, it was entering its most dangerous phase. Because now that the encirclement had been broken, both sides understood the truth. This fight was no longer about surprise. It was about survival. When American armored units punched through to Bastogne on December 26, 1944, they did not arrive to peace. They arrived to chaos. German artillery was still active. Snipers still held positions in surrounding woods. Roads were narrow, icy, and exposed to fire. The relief created a corridor, but that corridor had to be defended and expanded. If the Germans sealed it again, everything would collapse. Inside Bastogne, American soldiers who had been cut off for days stepped out of foxholes and damaged buildings to greet the incoming tanks. Supplies began to flow: ammunition, medical, equipment, winter clothing. Wounded men were evacuated, but there was no celebration. Everyone knew the enemy was still close. To the north and east of town, German units regrouped. Orders were clear: restore the encirclement if possible, or at least contain the American breakthrough. But reality was brutal. Fuel levels were dangerously low. Some armored units had to abandon vehicles simply because they could not move them. Others rationed movement carefully, saving just enough for critical moments. The German offensive had been designed around speed. Their initial success came from shock and rapid movement. Now that momentum was fading, the weaknesses became obvious. Supply trucks struggled to reach forward units. Allied aircraft, when weather allowed, attacked roads and columns. Every mile forward cost more than it gained. American commanders wasted no time. The U.S. Third Army, under General George S. Patton, did not simply relieve Bastogne and stop. The objective shifted immediately from rescue to expansion. The corridor south of Bastogne had to be widened. High ground had to be secured. German artillery positions had to be silenced. American infantry advanced through forests where visibility was limited to a few dozen yards. Snow muffled sound, making it difficult to detect movement. Patrols clashed in sudden, close-range firefights. Tanks pushed cautiously along frozen roads, aware that anti-tank weapons could be hidden behind any tree line. For German soldiers, the situation grew more tense by the day. Many had begun the offensive believing they were part of a bold move that could change the war. Now they faced increasing resistance and shrinking options. Units that had advanced deep into Allied lines suddenly found themselves at risk of being cut off. Communication problems added to the confusion. Radio signals were inconsistent in the dense forest. Orders sometimes arrived late or unclear. In some sectors, commanders made local decisions based on incomplete information. The larger picture was becoming harder to control. Meanwhile, American air power slowly returned as skies cleared. Fighter bombers roared over the Ardennes, targeting German supply lines. Trucks carrying fuel and ammunition were especially vulnerable. A single destroyed convoy could cripple a forward unit for days. German troops learned to move mostly at night, hiding vehicles under trees during daylight hours. The weather that had once shielded the German advance now worked against them. Clear skies meant Allied dominance in the air. Snow and ice made retreat just as dangerous as advance, and retreat was becoming a serious possibility. On the American side, morale strengthened with each confirmed gain. The successful relief of Bastogne was more than a tactical victory, it was psychological. Soldiers who had endured the shock of the initial German attack now felt momentum shifting. Confidence returned, but the fighting remained intense. German counterattacks did not stop overnight. In several sectors, armored clashes erupted in open fields where visibility briefly improved. Shells tore through snowbanks. Trees shattered from artillery blasts. The winter landscape became a battlefield of smoke and fire. One of the key struggles during this period was over road control. In the Ardennes, roads meant everything. Whoever held the intersections controlled movement of men and machines. American forces pushed aggressively to secure these junctions, knowing that German mobility depended on them. German commanders faced a growing dilemma. Continuing the offensive required fuel and fresh troops. Both were limited. Pulling back risked political consequences from Berlin. Adolf Hitler still demanded aggressive action, but the men on the ground saw the truth in front of them. Casualties were mounting, equipment losses were serious, and Allied pressure was increasing. Some German officers began to speak quietly among themselves about the sustainability of the operation. They recognized that the Ardennes gamble had been built on a narrow window of opportunity. That window was closing fast. By late December and early January, the battlefield dynamic had changed completely. The initial German thrust that created the bulge in Allied lines was losing depth. American and British forces attacked from multiple sides. The German salient, the outward push into Allied territory, became increasingly exposed. The relief of Bastogne played a central role in this shift. Without full control of that road hub, German forces could not coordinate effectively across WWII, the front. What had once been a spearhead now risked becoming a trap. American engineers worked constantly to repair damaged roads and bridges. Logistics teams pushed supplies forward despite cold and danger. The ability to maintain steady flow of fuel and ammunition gave the Allies a growing advantage. For German soldiers at the front, conditions were harsh beyond words. Many lacked proper winter clothing. Frostbite cases increased. Rations were stretched thin. Tanks sat idle to conserve fuel. Artillery units counted shells carefully before firing. Yet even in this difficult situation, fighting remained fierce. Small villages changed hands multiple times. Woods were contested yard by yard. Snipers and machine gun teams turned narrow. Clearings into deadly zones. The contrast between the two sides became sharper each day. The Americans, backed by industrial strength and improving logistics, could absorb losses and continue pushing. Germany, already exhausted from years of war on multiple fronts, struggled to replace what it lost. Strategically, the question was no longer whether Germany could win the Ardennes Offensive. The question was how much damage could still be done before it collapsed completely. As January progressed, Allied forces tightened pressure. The bulge in the line shrank steadily. German units that had once advanced confidently now withdrew under fire. Defensive positions were established, but they lacked the depth and preparation needed for long-term resistance. The story of these days is not one of sudden collapse, but of gradual realization. Each report of lost ground, each destroyed convoy, each failed counterattack chipped away at the remaining hope of success. The 48 hours that broke the encirclement at Bastogne did more than save a town. They disrupted timing, confidence, and coordination. And in modern warfare, timing can be everything. For American commanders, the focus remained clear: maintain pressure. Do not allow the Germans to regroup. Keep advancing. Every mile gained now would shorten the war in the West. For German leaders in the field, the focus shifted toward preservation. Save what could be saved. Avoid total encirclement. Delay where possible. Survive. The snow was still falling in the Ardennes, but the Americans were moving fast. Bastogne had been relieved, and the trapped soldiers now had supplies, warmth, and reinforcements. Yet the German forces did not give up. They tried to regroup, sending counterattacks wherever they could. Tanks rumbled along icy roads. Artillery. Shells cracked through the trees, and soldiers on both sides struggled through freezing mud and snow. Every step the Americans advanced made the German position weaker. Fuel shortages, overextended supply lines, and exhausted troops slowed their responses. The initiative had clearly shifted. What had once been a daring German offensive was now a fight just to survive. Inside German headquarters, officers stared at maps that no longer made sense. Commands from Berlin demanded aggressive action, but the reality on the ground was harsh. Units were low on men and equipment. Roads were clogged or destroyed. The snow that had once hidden the Americans now exposed German vulnerabilities. For the Americans, the push forward became easier each day. Engineers repaired roads, artillery support coordinated with advancing infantry, and every regained mile reinforced confidence. The Allies were not just reacting, they were dictating the pace. Bastogne had become more than a town. It was a turning point. The 48 hours that saved it had shifted momentum. The Germans could no longer control the tempo. And for the soldiers on the ground, both sides knew that from this point, the Ardennes Offensive was slowly slipping away from Germany. With Bastogne relieved and supplies flowing, the Allies were no longer reacting. They were taking control. American tanks moved along the icy roads, infantry pushed through forests, and artillery barrages softened German defenses. The snow that had once hidden movements now became a stage for careful, coordinated strikes. German units, exhausted and low on fuel, struggled to hold positions. Counterattacks were often piecemeal, poorly supplied, and easy for the Americans to repel. Every failed push made the defensive lines thinner. Officers in the field began to realize the grim truth. Momentum had left them. The initiative was firmly in Allied hands. The shrinking bulge in the line reflected the shift of power. Villages changed hands multiple times as both sides fought fiercely, but each gain by the Allies strengthened morale and confidence. Engineers repaired key roads, resupplied the front, and allowed tanks and artillery to maintain pressure. The Americans moved deliberately but relentlessly, forcing the Germans to react instead of act. By the end of the first week after Bastogne, the German offensive was faltering. Supply shortages, harsh winter conditions, and relentless Allied pressure made continued attacks nearly impossible. What had started as a bold plan to divide and conquer the Allies was now a fight to survive, a defensive struggle with little chance of success. Bastogne had become a symbol of resistance and a pivot for the entire Ardennes battle. The 48-hour relief had not just saved a town, it had shifted the war's momentum. And now, as the Allies pushed forward, the German forces were beginning to retreat, one step at a time. By early January 1945, the Ardennes Offensive had lost nearly all momentum. German forces, exhausted, low on fuel, and stretched thin across the snowy forests, could no longer mount effective attacks. The Americans had stabilized their lines, regained initiative, and began pushing the Germans back toward their starting positions. Bastogne, once surrounded and at the brink of collapse, had become the symbol of Allied resilience and determination. The bulge in the Allied line began to shrink day by day. Villages changed hands, forests were contested, but the Allies maintained relentless pressure. Tanks advanced along repaired roads, infantry secured key positions, and artillery fire forced German units into defensive postures. Every mile gained weakened the Germans further, and every successful maneuver boosted American morale. In the German command, the reality was unavoidable. Orders from Berlin demanding aggressive counterattacks fell flat. Units were too weak, supplies were too low, and winter conditions compounded every problem. Even the bravest commanders knew the offensive had failed. Momentum, once theirs, had shifted completely. For the Allies, this was more than a tactical success. It demonstrated the power of coordination, planning, and initiative. Speed, once a German advantage in the early years of the war, now belonged to the Americans. Bastogne's relief had created a turning point that Germany could not recover from. The Ardennes would no longer be a place of surprise attacks, but of calculated Allied control. As the battle wound down, German units withdrew under pressure, trying to preserve what remained of their strength. Roads cleared, supply lines restored, and the Allies consolidated their gains. History Plus reminds us that sometimes in war, it is not numbers alone, but timing, initiative, and bold decision-making that change everything. The 48 hours that broke Bastogne had become a defining moment, not just in the Ardennes, but in the entire Western Front campaign. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to History Plus for more engaging, clear, and fascinating World War II stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What surprised you the most about the Ardennes Offensive? Was it Patton's speed, the endurance of Bastogne's defenders, or the way the Germans underestimated the situation? Share this video with someone who loves history and let them see how 2 days in winter changed the course of the war. Because history is not just about events, it's about decisions, courage, and the moments that turn the tide. And Bastogne, In those 48 hours was one of the greatest examples of that truth.